Hi, y'all. So, I hope you're having a it's Tuesday for me. Lovely Tuesday if it's Tuesday for you. But we are talking about socialization. I'm gonna briefly go through this because I more so want to highlight your theories here with this week. But nonetheless, socialization is a very important topic within sociology. And so, without further ado, I will share my screen. I'm just going to put myself in the corner. Hopefully that works. Okay, so starting off, first and foremost, a social environment is an entire human environment. Um, and it can be really anything here. It's not just inside or outdoors, right? It's really wherever we are at during a certain time. So take a second, think about this. I would ask you if we were in person, but can't do that. How might our social environment affect our abilities to socialize? Could there, furthermore, think about it, be negative aspects of socialization here? Could something be impeding our ability to socialize? I know that, for example, me having this online class kind of impedes me as a teacher to really see you and engage with you, and ask you questions. And so, this aspect of teaching online is socially impacting me in the process of how I teach and socialize with my students, for example. But getting into it, within this topic, your textbook also discusses this aspect of nature versus nurture and kind of understanding both in they're often posed as being in conflict with one another, and one often is viewed as better than the other, right? And oftentimes you hear people say, well, it's always nature or it's always nurture, right? How you're raised versus the sort of genetics that you're born with, and that aspect. The reality of the situation is that it's both, right? It's important to recognize how much our nature impacts us, as well as how we are raised and what environment we are raised in, because both are relevant in understanding how a person is socialized within an environment. And sometimes within situations, it might be more so nurture, right? Or it might be more so nature that impacts an individual. But nonetheless, it would be not, well, it wouldn't be objective to remove one of these aspects when explaining an individual and their environment. So, early sociology researched and looked at how societies have impacted us, and in what ways do we represent us, right? It's very philosophical here. I'm going to be talking about a lot of philosophy, so keep that in mind with this video. But feral children is an important term within sociology. It is assumed to have been, these are kids assumed to have been raised by animals in the wilderness, isolated from humans. You also have the term isolated children. These children are without language. Um, this is a quote from one of the textbooks I used for this class, but it's not the current textbook. It says, without language, there can be no culture, no shared way of life, and culture is the key to what people become. And so, being highlighted here with feral children and isolated children, as well as institutionalized children and deprived animals, is the aspect of socialization and how important it is to socialize with other people. Because if we do not, then it can be seen that we might act out in particular ways, as seen with the feral children as well as the isolated children. Because, for example, with the isolated children, when you have an instance where a child is held against their will in a certain area or isolated from society for a number of different reasons, right? And it doesn't always have to be a heinous one, right? Where they're being locked up. But nonetheless, you have a child who is isolated. They are not properly being socialized with the rest of society. They're also not really learning the culture, how to connect with other people. Because we, without realizing it, learn the culture from a very young age. We also pick up language from a very young age. And language is one of the things, anthropologists discuss this, that tie us to each other and our culture. And without that aspect of socialization, we therefore cannot connect with our culture and society. So I'm going to be so socialization here is a process by which people learn the characteristics of their group. When you're not part of a group, you're not learning any characteristics. Therefore, you don't know how to behave. And so it is very important in the process of socialization to learn the characteristics of a given group. This includes the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, the values, the norms, the actions thought appropriate for them. For example, maybe you went to public school or private school or the like, right? But nonetheless, you interacted with other kids when you were a kid. And more likely than not, you were taught by your teacher, your parents, and the like to not hit the other kid because that's a bad thing to do. You shouldn't hurt other people. When you're a child, you're slowly learning what is appropriate and how you should conduct yourselves, i.e., you're learning the process of socialization and how to connect with other people. So, take some time, think about the statement, reflect upon it. But what do you think of the statement that society makes us human? Does society make us human? And in what ways does society make us human? Just take some time, reflect on that question. Um, I, this is optional. I know that you're already working on your essay, so again, this is optional. But I have some videos that really discuss socialization here and kind of take it a step further into um, contemporary issues within our society. The example here is the YouTube video, What Rats Can Teach Us About Addiction, and the history of rats in research. Because this video, I won't get into it fully, but it's important to the discussion of socialization because rats are very social creatures. When scientists were conducting research on rats to test this aspect of how drugs affect them and how certain drugs might affect them, like heroin, what they found was these rats were more so when they were isolated in a given environment, they were more likely to take the heroin. When they were socialized with other rats, they were more likely to wean off the heroin and get on water and get better. And so, what this research kind of teaches us, or could teach us, is the potentials for socialization as well as addiction and understanding what addiction looks like and how we might, I know we're not rats here, but we are social creatures. We need to connect with other people. And so, how might this study, if you so choose to look at it, watch the video, kind of connects our understandings of addiction and drug usage. So again, you don't have to watch the video, but it's very interesting nonetheless. The orphanage experiment is Understanding how the care of children essentially can impact their IQ levels. What was found in these orphanage experiments was that children who were treated poorly had lower IQs versus children who were properly treated and their needs were met. And these needs can be as simple as providing shoes for a child, can drastically impact a child's IQ. And this is what the experiments get at, really, is how socialization might further allow us to understand the world around us in unique ways, affecting our IQ levels. Um, in Romania, they conducted the orphanage experiment. What they essentially found was that those who were living in an orphanage had a lower IQ than those in foster care. Um, Further hinting at how maybe nurture might impact IQ levels here for children. Again, these are studies. This is another good video on solitary confinement and how, again, I tend to use examples because it helps in understanding these processes and these sociological terms. And so, if you want to watch this video, I highly recommend it. It is slightly intense to watch, but it also gets at the crucial questions of what what systems do we have in place, um, that what types of systems that we currently have in place that impact people in their ability to socialize. And what do those systems look like? Like solitary confinement. And the fact that you can't really socialize with other people when you are in solitary confinement. And so it's another critical look at how socialization truly impacts a person in very, sometimes extreme manners. So, we're kind of getting into the philosophy. Sociology was developed from philosophy, so there is quite a bit of philosophy within sociology. Fun fact. But an important term to start off with, an idea, is the self in mind, and understanding how our sense of self can develop from the interaction of others, according to Cooley. And this sort of development of a self concept, another term developed by Cooley, develops and begins from a very early age and never stops. Stated differently, we continuously develop a self concept or an identity, right, as we age. And that identity might take shape in multiple forms. And we might change as a person, and so we're not the same person as we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? And that's what Charles Horton Cooley really discusses here. He further develops the term, this is important, the looking glass self. And this term contains three elements. We imagine how we appear to those around us. We are looking to others. We imagine how they interpret us, right? We further interpret their reactions to us, kind of come to some conclusions about that, and then we develop a self-concept. We develop a self-concept by looking to others, seeing how we appear to them, and further interpreting whatever they think about us, and that develops our identity. Mead is also an important theorist here. George Herbert Mead kind of understands that we take on the role of the other from a very early age. What that is getting at is we kind of emulate other people, which we do. Young children, um, if you recall back to you being very young, or if you have young children yourself, you will notice that they emulate those around them. they tend to copy or mimic certain things, right? They might say things that you say, or they might do things that you do, or they might, I don't know, have particular facial expressions that you might have. And so they might mimic that in particular ways. This is seen, for example, with videos where you see the like parent, mom or dad laughing and their kid starts to laugh because they're mimicking that behavior. They are starting to learn what's funny, in other words, which is an interesting aspect of this. But again, they're observing other people and they're observing and mimicking those who are significant others. This isn't someone who's you're romantically involved with. For Mead, instead, significant others are individuals who significantly impact and influence someone else. This can be parents, teachers, siblings, peers, the list goes on here. But these are significant people in that person's life. The generalized other, I just moved myself, is the norms, values, attitudes, and expectations of people in general. It's kind of a summary of it. The child's ability to take the role of the generalized other is a significant step to the development of self. Stated differently, children again learn that it's not okay to hit someone. That is the generalized other. That's the expectation and the norm that you shouldn't hurt another person. That a group takes on, in other words. I hope that makes sense. And this helps to develop the self, right? Where we learn from a young age that we shouldn't hurt other people. We should treat other people with kindness, for example. There are different levels to this sort of taking on the role of the other. For Mead, you have the first one is imitation. Imitation is usually seen with children under the age of 3, where they usually have, well, they don't have any sense of self, and so they have to imitate others. They learn through others. Versus play. The stage of play here is ages 3 to 6. Play helps them pretend different things. They learn the process of doing stuff through pretending and play. So, for example, kids learn how to be the mommy and the daddy because they play and they play pretend. They play pretend and play house because of that. And they learn that sort of process at a young age. Stage 3 is team games. So after about the age of 6 or 7, team games are organized play. It's like sports, especially for young children. It's important because it helps them connect with other people, learn the process of being a team, working with other people, and the like here. It's also an important stage because it simultaneously teaches them that they can't do everything by themselves. Piaget um, is another important theorist here, mainly in the field of psychology and philosophy, but nonetheless, Jean Piaget here is very important to sociology. He kind of further takes the stages here of development and treats it as operational, that there's an operation happening and how we conduct ourselves from a very, very young age. So the first stage for him is the sensor motor stage. This is from birth to age 2. This is where children and kids and babies have limited abilities. They can't really do a lot. Maybe, they can walk around, babble, start to talk, maybe form some words but not others. They might be able to do certain things, but they can't really, like, for example, they might have trouble catching something or they might have trouble keeping balance, right? Because they're so young. And so they have limited abilities here. Versus the second stage, the pre-operational stage. This is from ages 2 to 7. This is when children develop the ability to use symbols. This is where children learn what things are essentially and learn how to point at stuff and know what that means, right? And so when they point at the color blue, for example, they can accurately say blue versus when they point at the color red, they can accurately say red. Um, or when they see a particular food, like an apple, they can point at that apple and say apple, right? And so this is the stage where they start to attach stuff and they start to symbolically understand stuff. Stage 3 is the concrete operational stage. This is where their abilities remain concrete, i.e., this stage is slightly hard to understand. But essentially, what Pigot is getting at here is that children learn stuff that won't change. Um, Other stuff will change, obviously, but other stuff won't, right? When a child learns that 2 plus 2 equals 4, that will never change. That will stay consistent throughout the whole life. And it is to remain concrete for that reason. Stage 4 is the formal stage, 12 and up. And this highlights again the sort of process of peers here, teamwork, group building, and the like. We also need to discuss Freud. So, Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis. He develops 3 elements of a personality. And these elements are the id, ego, and superego. If you had intro to psychology or the like, I guarantee that you've already learned these terms. Id is the inborn basic drives, allows us to seek gratification. The ego is the demands of the id, and society's demands of suppressing it. The superego is the conscience or moral compass. So, according to Freud, when it gets out of hand, we seek out our pleasure. Ego helps to balance that desire, but when our ego gets out of hand, we become rigid and strict. Hope that makes sense. So, for example, our id might be um hmm, drinking. Um, that might be when we drink too much. And so when our id is out of kind of line and we desire to drink so much, we need our ego to help us balance it out. But maybe our ego is too strong that we just refuse to drink alcohol entirely. And maybe we might be might appear rigid to other people because we don't want to drink. And so there's a balance. There's the super ego when we might balance our id and ego in how we feel about drinking. That's just one example. Then you have Kohlberg stages. The What's important with Kohlberg is that um, he's discussing universal ways of figuring out how to be moral and conduct yourself morally speaking. This has some issues because there's no universal way of figuring out what is moral. Cultures differ in various reasons, and so morals, therefore, differ from culture to culture. And so we might find one moral in one culture and a completely different moral in another culture. And so that's a major critique of Kohlberg here. But um, the first stage for him is the amoral stage, where he states that there is no right or wrong, especially in how children don't understand right or wrong here. The pre-conventional stage is the learned rules, where we start to learn what rules are, how we should conduct ourselves, what the norms are, what the taboos are, what we shouldn't do, what we should do within our culture. And we learn that pretty quickly. The conventional stage is so you've learned the rules. Now you start to follow them. And this is following the norms and values that we learned in our younger days. Post-conventional stage is the fourth stage, where people are able to reflect on what is right and wrong and judge others accordingly. This is obviously the problem stage that receives a lot of critiques because, again, cultures differ. What we consider to be right and wrong differs from culture to culture, and therefore, we can't really define or say to another person who's part of a different culture that they're right or wrong about something because they grew up in a completely different culture. We don't know the context. Um, Again, major critique for Kohlberg. If you want more videos on the process of socialization and how it ties to gender, I have, or that's not the one on gender. The other video is coming up, but this is a very interesting video. It's essentially studying whether or not babies are able to uh, know and they have the ingrained notion to understand what's right and what's wrong. So if you wish to watch it, please do so. And then when you're done watching it, critique it. What are the issues with this video? How might the researchers be wrong here? Um, we'll talk about the sociology of gender. Um, what I will briefly review here is that gender is also a part of socialization. We learn to socialize given our gender, and that's what sociologists highlight here, is that, for example, a good example of this is young kids are taught what to play with given their gender. Girls are taught to play with dolls and stuffed animals and the like, while boys are taught to play with trucks and uh, puzzles and the like. And so, what's the major issue here is that the softer stuff, like dolls, like stuffed animals, don't really allow for critical thinking, like puzzles do. And so, it's also that critical look at how do we raise our kids so that they can be socialized from a young age to understand stuff and critically think about stuff, even though they're young babies that nonetheless doesn't keep them from developing and learning stuff from a very, very young age. So, again, a very important video on socialization and gender. I also have some examples of gender in advertising, how we are socialized to feel particular ways when we are advertised to. This is also what sociologists talk about. And so these again are examples, how you often see young girls on advertisements for um, different toys like dolls versus when you have advertisements for tools and the like, you often see a young boy in that sort of advertisement. When you see advertisements that are geared towards kitchen, cooking, cleaning, you oftentimes see women in those commercials and women in those advertisements. Again, it's how gender is a socialization process. This is gender stereotypes in ads. It's a great example of gender and socialization. Again, a video that I highly recommend. If we were in class, I would just show you and force you all to watch this, but we aren't, so Watch it if you so wish. Another example of gender in film, and another example of gender and film with the Barbie movie. Da, 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 da. I think the last thing to note is the agents of socializations and what that looks like. So these are essentially people in groups that are affecting our self-concept constantly. So, for example, our family is considered an agent of socialization, as well as social class and work, what social class that we were raised in, middle class, upper class, lower class, and the like, and how that might impact us. Um, as well as the neighborhood that we grew up with. That might also impact us. Religion, daycare, school, peer groups all impact us in unique ways. And we don't really recognize this until, I mean, either you take a sociology class or you start to critically look at the groups that you're a part of and how much you pick up that given behavior. So just consider this and think about it for this week, right? How you might pick up behaviors from your parents, from your peers, and the like, and what that looks like. What does that behavior look like, right? A good example of this is how much we get our humor from our friends. And we tend to find stuff that is funny um, the same way that our friends find stuff funny, right? Very similar. Da, da, da. Total institutions is another important term within sociology. It was developed by Irving Goffman. This is an understanding of kind of questioning what happens when you have total, total instances where there is no aspect of socialization, where people are kept locked up. And so, Irving Goffman took a look at some of these examples here with boot camps, concentration camps, etc., and how these particular environments deeply, deeply impact a person. So, for him, total institutions refers to a place where people are cut off from the rest of society and where they come under almost total control of the officials who are in charge. And so I gave examples here. Within this concept of total institution, he comes up with the term degradation ceremony. This is essentially the process of dehumanizing an individual and stripping them down to simple numbers. Because that's what was seen, for example, with Jewish people, with people with disabilities, with LGBTQ plus people in concentration camps. And so, because those types of people were given a particular symbol that represented them. And so Jewish people were given the symbol of stars on their uniform when they were in concentration camps, the same way that gay men were given a particular example, or a particular symbol on their attire when they were also in concentration camps during this time, during the Holocaust. And so, the degradation ceremony is again that process of dehumanization, stripping an individual of their identity. And so, what a person experiences when entering a this is what a person experiences when they enter a total institution. This is an attempt to remake the self by stripping away the individual's current identity and stamping a new one in its place. For example, with concentration camps, and I'm just going to use the concentration camps example because it's the most known for a lot of American students. With concentration camps, they completely strip that individual down to putting a number on their arm, as well as having them wear particular attire. They couldn't choose their own attire. They had a particular uniform that they had to wear. They didn't go by their name. And so that is an example of completely stripping down an individual and their identity, as well as having total control of what they're able to do in their social setting. What's further important here with the degradation ceremony is the idea of the personal identity kit. How much our items, what we wear, what we surround ourselves with, really ties into our identity. And when you remove that or strip that, you are also stripping that individual's identity. And so, for example, this has been seen with Native Americans and how, historically speaking, by stripping away their lands, you're also stripping away their personhood, their identity, where they're allowed to conduct their ceremonies and their religious practices. That's one example. And that was especially seen in America, that we did that. But another example here was the process found again, Nazi Germany concentration camps, where early on Jewish people, their houses were raided, their items were completely taken out of their homes, including books the that Germany didn't agree with during that time, Nazi regime didn't agree with, and those books were burned. And those books were part of those people's identities and their culture. This is a very important concept in understanding something like this. And those are just some examples. I highly recommend finding your own examples throughout history. Um, okay, last thing to note before I end this video is how socialization looks through a life course. So we go through our childhood, we go through adolescence, we have transitional adulthood where we learn how to pay taxes, how to, I don't know, get insurance and sign up for it. We learn how to keep a savings account. We learn how to properly keep a credit card and not go over that money spent. We learn these processes within adulthood and we adult um, through that sort of process. We're also transitioning when we go from high school to college, right? Or college to a job and getting married. The list goes on here. Middle years is a stage in and of itself. You're maybe raising kids, living on your own, um, vacationing, right? Uh, Seeking a career, or you already have a career, right? And so it's that focused versus older years. Older years, you have older people maybe retiring. Maybe they're not retiring and they're continuing to work. Maybe they're, I don't know, seeking romance. And that might be a part of their stage during their life course. Again, it's kind of looking at the life course of socialization here and what we might go through. Okay, I'm going to stop share. So, I hope that my forehead wasn't cut off for most of that video. If it was, oh well. So that's socialization. I'll I'll lecture next week, so um I'll see you then. Hope you have a fantastic week, whatever week it is that hopefully you're watching this on week 2, but yeah. Um, but have a fantastic week.